Okay, if you haven't saved your work, this would be a good time to save the work. And in this tutorial, we're going to go over creating localized fog. Now, before we go and drop it into this scene, what we're going to do is we're going to, I'm going to stop that. We're going to create a new scene, and I want to go over some of the basics in this new scene because we're introducing a lot of new ideas to make this happen. And so I'm going to go ahead and hit new. I've found that it used to always just Command N would make a new scene, but it looks like that might have changed. Yeah, it says new project up here, but if depending on where I have things selected, that's not necessarily the case. So I have a new project. I'm just going to go to the standard view, so I have a big viewport open. And to start with, I want to create as a volume of fog. I want to create a space where there is fog. And there is, so to start with, I'm going to create a cube. And let's say we wanted to create a fog bank that, I'm going to rotate my view a touch so maybe I can see that point. Let's see here. Okay, there we go, cool. Let's say we wanted to create a fog bank, and I'm just using some tools to stretch this out a little bit. Oh, of course I'm going to do it uniformly. So I will instead do this and just pull these out a little bit. So let's say we want to make a fog bank that, granted, we probably wouldn't want it to necessarily be perfectly rectangular, but we want to create a fog bank that looks like this, that hovers close to, say, a ground plane. And yeah, okay. So this is what we would like to do. So we'd like this to be fog. How do we make this fog? So to make this fog, the very first thing we need to do is we need to create our object, and then we need to use the volume builder. Now, there are other tutorials coming up in this series where we're going to go into other uses of the volume builder and how you can actually use it to create really complex meshes, and you can do some really cool stuff with it. In this case, we're going to be using it to look at how we can create fog, as I said before. So step 1, right, you make your cube. Step 2, you create a volume builder. And step 3, you make the cube a child of the volume builder. Now, when you've done that, you get this crazy looking shape. And if I was to go to Redshift and actually render this, there's nothing there, right? There's just absolutely nothing in the scene whatsoever. And that's because if I uncheck the volume builder, right, there's my cube. And that's because what the volume builder is doing is it's basically creating a bunch of these voxels. And voxels are, right, volumetric pixels. They all represent a unit of volume. And so it's different than the way that we typically model things where this cube is just surfaces, right? So with this, there's no surfaces, so there's nothing to render right now. We have to do a couple more steps in order to get it to be visible to a camera and visible to lights and all of that. So let's click on our volume builder, and I'm going to go ahead and go back to my standard view. Hold on. Is this? Okay, good. That stopped. Great. All right. So I'm going to go back to my standard view. I'm going to select the volume builder, and we're going to look at some of these settings. So first, there's this voxel size, right? That sets the resolution. Because we're doing fog, we probably don't need it to be any smaller. I'm going to set this to 1 just so you can see. Right, so now it looks a lot more like a cube. If I zoom in, you can still see that pixelated edge, but it's significantly smaller than it was before, right? And that means it's just a lot higher resolution. Now, something to be aware of is that this gets significantly more expensive to do as this value gets smaller because there are so many more voxels being generated. There's a point where if you go below 1, you will get a warning from Cinema saying, hey, this might take a while to do. And Cinema doesn't do that for many things, so they mean it. It can just never finish. So if you're swiping around on here all crazy and you hit 1/1000th of a centimeter sized voxels, you should cancel that because it's going to take forever to finish, or it will break your computer. It'll break in the process. And so usually when I'm working on things and I'm trying to work quickly and not have it bog my system down, I usually use 10 or 5 centimeters based on the size of the object that I'm working on. So in this case, this thing is huge and it's fog, so I'm going to say 10 centimeters. And so I've got my cube here. Now, there's another thing I need to change, right? This is currently a signed distance field, which we're not going to talk about what that means exactly. But the one we want, surprisingly enough, is called fog. And if I click on that, it's going to look even weirder. But what this is doing is it's basically like, you can imagine it as just like a huge field of foggy particles that are spread uniformly throughout the entirety of this volume, right? And so this is the type of volume that we want in order to create this effect that we're going for. So let's go ahead and see if we can see this yet. All right, so I'm going to hit play and nothing. Right? Let's go ahead and create another cube in the center of this space, and we'll hit play and just be like, okay, we can't actually see that. We just can't see the fog. So how are we going to get this fog to be visible? Well, there's one major step that we need to do next, which is to create a material that will allow us to see the fog. So let's go ahead and go over here. We're going to click on this plus and hold. We're going to go to materials, and this time we are going to be creating a volume. So I'm going to come down here, I'm going to go to volume. I've made a redshift volume. It's this now. This isn't a noise volume, it's a little different. And you'll see, yeah, it's got some similarities, but one of the things we'll do first is let's just go ahead and drop this volume on our volume builder. Now that we've got that material on there, you'd think that it would show up, but it is not ready. It is not ready to reveal itself to the world yet. We need to go ahead and double click on our volume material. And once we've done that, you'll see that we've got slightly different settings than we had previously with the noise volume, right? The very first thing that's absolutely crucial, it's easy to miss, it's hard to remember, is to set our channel. And what the heck does that mean? Honestly, I haven't read deeply into why they do this system, but basically we have to go to presets. What we want to do is we want to go down to volume builder, and you want to use the volume builder that you're currently, this material is attached to, right? So in our case, it's just called volume builder. If we had two volume builders in here, like if I was to click off of this and just create another volume builder, notice we have volume builder and volume builder.1. If I come over here now and go to volume builders, you'll see I have two options, right? So you just want to make sure you're choosing the correct one. It might be good to rename them as like low fog or something like that, but I'm not going to do that right now. So I'm going to click on volume builder. And as soon as I do that, I want you to note that our cube has vanished partway. That's a really good sign, right? That means that something is happening. But you'll notice that it's kind of vanishing into a dark soup right now. And that's because of our absorption. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But the two things that we need to adjust, and the setting that, even though one is the setting that's the default for whatever reason, the setting that seems to work as a good starting point is, again, it's 0.001. And so if I set that for my scatter coefficient, and I come down here, I also need to set it for my absorption coefficient. And we'll talk about the difference between these two and what they do in just a second. Okay. So I've set those, and I can barely see anything, and that's actually probably a good sign. All right, so you can see that there's some interesting noise happening there as this thing renders. Let's go ahead, and I'm going to drop an area light in the scene. And I'm going to lift it up out of here. And I want you to note that now that there's a light in the scene, I can actually see some fog. So I'm going to lift this up a little bit higher, and I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees, maybe a little bit more, so we have kind of some shadow on the fog. The letter E. and pull this down just a touch this way. Okay, and I want you to see that, right, it's still filling in there, and that's because it takes a lot more work for the fog to render cleanly when there's an object behind it, right? It's anything that's somewhat transparent is always going to have more noise while it renders. Eventually, this will all match the surrounding area, or we might need to adjust the number of samples that it's using in order to make those calculations. But we're not going to worry about that too much right now. Right, so now we have this really nice thin fog bank. It's even, it's gray, and although it's squared off, it does at least have rounded corners. If I choose my cube real quick, well, is that the right one? No, that's the wrong one. I'm going to delete this volume builder we're not using, and I'm going to select the actual cube I want to use. I might go ahead and make this a little bit thicker, and so we have a little bit more fog to work with. Okay, so I've made this a little thicker, but it's pretty boring, right? It's just fog. It's just a solid blank of fog. It'd be nice to have some noise on here. Now, there's we could potentially create a node network and get some noise coming in here somewhere, but I'm going to show you a different way to create noise using the volume builder. So we talked about fields previously, and fields are pretty remarkable. They're right. You can adjust the amount of that a deformer is applied. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to be using it to create noisy volume using the volume builder. So if I go and I create a random field, and I go ahead and drag this field down and make it a child of my volume builder, you can already see something happening here, right? And you can kind of see it in my work view too. You can see this cube that's like a noisy like a noisy fog cube. If I hide my other cube, you're going to see it more, right? It's definitely more visible here. And so that cube is this random field. I'm going to actually leave that turned off because the render view is actually pretty good at seeing this. And so there's two things I need to do. So first, I'm going to select my volume builder. And right now, I just have, they're sort of acting as two independent objects that are part of this same volume builder. And if you note, when I select my volume builder, I come down here to this area. These are all the children. These are the objects that are making this up. And when I'm in fog mode, there's several different blend modes I have for these different layers or different objects that are in here. And so one of them is multiply. So if I go ahead and click multiply, you'll see anything that's 0 is going to be multiplied, and then a value is multiplied by it, it's going to be 0, so it'll disappear. So right, we just have this one little wedge left over where there's two, where this intersection is happening right now. And I could just use the noise field and make it, because I'm creating a cube. But what's awesome about using multiply is I could put any object in here. I could put a cone or a cylinder or a sphere or whatever, and I can then add noise to it, set it to multiply, and if I get the dimensions correct, then the entire object will be, it'll be a mix of that noise. So let's take a look at that real quick before I go further with this cube. If I was to go ahead and add a cone and drop the cone into this field as well, you'll note that now I actually have a cone of fog. Now, so this is another thing where doing this system and using the volume builder in different volumes means that I could have, say, this could be this could be the back of an engine, and this could be a cone of, ionized gas or whatever, flying out the back of it. So there are benefits to doing this, even though it is pretty tedious. It means that we don't have to deal with fog being in there. So if I wanted to have this whole cone be that noise, what I can do is maybe I can start by leaving it here. I'm going to go to my random field, and you'll see that there are this scale setting, right? And I can come over to my coordinates and I could try and set scale here. But oddly, with the volume builder, what you have to do is you select the volume builder, go to the Object tab, and if you want to adjust the size of one of the children, you select it here. So I say random field, and then I get this creation space dialog over here, and I'm going to pull this over so we can see it better. And this is where I can make adjustments. So I know I want my cone, I want this cube to basically cover up my cone. So I'm going to go ahead and make this for, let's say 300. I feel like that's as tall as that is, maybe. Right, so it's made it a little bigger. I don't notice any changes because of how it's interacting with this other cube. So let's go ahead and change this to normal. So we can see that, right? And so now my cone is indeed, if I actually reframe this right, my cone is indeed totally covered in fog. I'm going to go ahead and hide my original cube so you can kind of see this a little bit better, right? So I've got this cone in there. You can see the edges of it. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, well, let's change the blend mode of my cone, let's say to multiply. And when I do that, now I just have that noisy fog in the shape of the cone, right? So similar to the cube, that's why I'm showing you this method, is because you can apply it to every object and have success this way. You can also look at like what happens with, other options. If I subtract this, right, there's actually now, if you were to go in here, there's going to be a cavity, a cone-shaped cavity inside of this noise field. There's divide as well, which looks a lot like, oops, I did that on the wrong one. Hold on a second. Let's try divide over here, right? You can see that's kind of like multiply. It does things a little bit differently. Add, they just get added together. In this case, it's not really that useful. But if we were to, but it may be useful in certain cases, but not with what we're doing. Max, you can see that makes some changes as well. And min is similar to multiply, but I want you to note it's a little bit less, like there's just slight differences. And so really it's like what works best with your setup. In our case, multiply would probably be our best option, but we're not going to have a cone in there, although we may have a cone surrounded by fog. So let's go ahead and select our random field again. There we go. And if we look at our cube, right, our original cube, and we turn the visibility of that on, and we select the cube here, you'll note that I can't really do any changes to the workspace, right? I can't adjust the scale here. And that's because it has its own scale as an object. So if I select this in the hierarchy, you'll see I've got these three sizes. If I click on size and I right click and hit copy, right, I want to make sure all three of those are all orange, right? Not just the X or the Y or the Z, but if I click on the word size, I can select it all. So I've copied all three of these places. I'm going to come over to my random field. I'm going to go to my volume builder, then select the random field, then click on this S here. I'm going to right click. I'm going to go ahead and paste this. And so now that fog, right, is taking up the same amount of space as the cube, right? And because I have this set to normal, there's nothing too exciting happening right now. I am going to go ahead and change this to multiply. And that should actually do a better job blending those two things together. And so you can kind of see with this cone how, right, this fog works. Like it's, it's more dense here on the edges. I can actually see a little bit deeper. And yeah, we've got some fog. Similar to the noise volume, we can, right, adjust our lighting. There's all sorts of different settings we can do here, right? I can adjust my tint for scatter, right? And so scatter is basically light that hits, bounces off, and comes back to the camera, right? And that's what this scatter coefficient is. So the higher this number is, the more blasted out and white everything will be. So if I was to set this back to 1, like it was set to at default, right, I'm going to get this really bright area. And you can kind of see on the edges, I'm getting some scatter, but barely. And that's just because it's blown out because it's so bright, right? Every single ray of light that's trying to enter in this is bouncing back towards the camera. That's what happens when the scatter coefficient is is high. So I'm going to set this back down to 0.01. Let's see what that looks like. Perfect. Now, the absorption coefficient is the opposite. The absorption coefficient is how much basically is where light is being absorbed. Instead of bouncing off, it's like bouncing in and being absorbed and lost. And so it's going to be darker. And so if I was to set this to gorgeous like blue, right, you can kind of see that there isn't, like, I'm not really getting a whole lot of change there. And part of that is because these are so mismatched. So let's go ahead and set this to 1/100th as well. And you can kind of see now it's like, it very lightly tinted that. And honestly, I feel like it gave it a lot more depth. Because it just feels more whole. If I was to make this an even deeper purple, you can start to see we can get some really cool color combinations out of this. I do want you to note that, you know, as something's closer to a light source, there's going to be more scatter. When the fog is further from a light source, there's going to be more absorption, right? So the light source is over here, it's hitting this part. So that's why we're getting more of a purplish blue in here and more of a whitish red on this other side. Right, we can also deal with these gradients and stuff. That's something you can experiment with. It's not super necessary for what we're doing here. The anisotropy, again, right, we can use this to kind of adjust the feel more subtly, right? Boosting it makes it feel much darker, and it's not really as, it's not, right, not as much light is bouncing off in this setting. If I go down the other direction, right, it probably, you can see that, right, again, it's really changing how this looks. But this is a really nice fine-tuned way to be like, oh, I kind of like how it looks, but I wish it was just a little bit more dramatic, right? And so now I've got something that's, you know, much darker. And I'm actually really happy with the fog looking the way it does right now. So I've got all of this done. I'm going to save this. This would be a great file to keep on hand as just like because when you forget all the steps you need to do to actually have fog function, you can come back to this file and just copy and paste this over and then tweak things or just look at it and be like, oh, I need to set the channel to volume builder. So I'm just going to call this the, we'll just say this localized fog template. Okay, so since I'm happy with this, I don't really need the cone in the scene at all, so I'm going to go ahead and probably pull that out of there, and now you can see that it's actually geometry again. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off, and I'm just going to be selecting my volume builder with its children. I'm going to go ahead and copy that. I'm going to save this again. I'm going to close my node editor, and I'm going to come over to Foggy, the scene that I want to do work in, and it's going to update. I'm going to stop the render view for a second. I'm going to paste this fog into my scene, if that actually, there we go. I'm going to paste that fog into my hierarchy, and now I need to figure out where that's at in my scene and how big it is. So let's go ahead and look at our cube first. So let's say let's go ahead and try and make this the same size as our landscape, at least in the X and the Z. We're not so worried about Y right now. So let's make this 1,000 by 1,000. Okay, so I've made that 1,000 by 1,000. I'm going to turn the volume builder's visibility off so that I can actually see this plane, right? You can kind of see this in here now. I'm going to go ahead and hide that. And I might actually turn our environment off to see if I can make that a little bit easier to see, but it's fighting me. It doesn't want to give up the ghost. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to just move this over, You can see even at 1,000 by 1,000, right, that's just one tile because we have such a huge scene. I'm going to go ahead and just stretch this out in this dimension. It doesn't need to be any wider, and it doesn't really need to be any taller, right? It's going to fill in this valley pretty nicely. So now that I've set that up, I can go ahead and do that same process I did before, where I can take my size, I can right click, copy it, go to my volume builder, select my random field, select the S over here by the X, and paste this in here. And then if I turn this back on, you'll see that that I've got this set, but you'll notice it's offset. It's not quite where I want it to be. So I need to go ahead and move this over too. It looks like it did not move with the other element, which is totally fine. We've got that worked out. Okay, so now let's go ahead and preview this and see what we get. Okay, so now we've got some fog down in this valley. Now it's bright pink, and it doesn't look quite so amazing right now, but part of that is a couple of settings we can adjust here. One, there's the scale of our noise, right? Right now, it's because we're so far away from it, that noise is really small. And so we're going to go ahead and set our global scale to just 2000% and see what changes that makes for us. Right, so now you can see that we're actually getting a lot more variation in that surface. Right, we can, it looks like it's actually thinner. I'm going to go ahead and open up my material manager and then double click to create this, to open this up, because what I'd like to do is I'm going to take these back to, I think they were both set to white by default. So let's go ahead and set these back to white. Let's see what happens in our scene. Right, it's really subtle down there. It's not super thick. So I think what we need to do is maybe we need to set our, let's see here, select our noise. Where did I put it? Oh, sorry, select our random field here. And let's make this 1000% instead of 2000%. That should thicken things up a little bit. And then I think the next thing we really need to do is, right, we want this to be more visible, right? And we're not anywhere near as close to it. So let's go ahead and set our, let's leave our absorption color actually pretty low for now, even though I was super excited about that. And I'm going to drop, I'm going to set the anisotropy back to the default. I can't remember what it is. So I'm just going to right click on the word and say reset to default. So 0 is the median. That should already start to make things a little bit more foggy down there. And then if I go up to my scatter coefficient and I was to set this to 1/10, I should get significantly heavier fog in the valley at this point. Right? And so really these, scale is hugely important in terms of how we work with this fog. So the other thing I would like to do is I would like to make this random field and my cube taller. So I'm going to start with the cube. It's 100. I'm going to make it 400 so we get some real depth here. Now you're not going to notice any change yet, really. And that's because, right, we're doing a multiply. So both the cube and the random field need to be at the same height in order for this to be visible. So in this case, I'm going to make this 400 as well in the Y. And so now I should have, right, a ton more fog, right? This is, right, much more substantial in the scene than it was previously, but it's now hopefully giving you some better idea of what this can possibly look like. Now, obviously, bright white fog isn't really going to be what we'd like to do there. So I'm kind of judging on colors in the background. Like maybe I actually take, I don't want to deal with that right now. That's hilarious. Let's go ahead and deny that. It actually made it brown. That's so funny. Let's go ahead and try and make this like a little bit warmer, right? So you can see now I've got some fog there. And then, right, the absorption color, which is also should be closer to the bottom, instead of being bright white, let's go ahead and actually make that, maybe we could make it almost blue. Maybe there's water down there. And we want to be able to sort of see that that blue come through in that absorption. Let's see if we get anything interesting in there. Right, and so our fog right now, right, our cube ends here and here. So we probably need to make it a little bit wider as well now that we've made it taller. So I am going to make it, let's see here, I've got that 2000. This one's probably accurate, but let's go ahead and set this to 3000. And then I'm going to go ahead and set the cube's dimensions as well. And it looks like that one's already, I'm going to make this 4000. And then I'm going to, oh, this is the one that probably needs to be, let's make this 3000. And then we should go back and do 3000 for the other. You can already see on this side, it's snaking down into those valleys a little bit. So if I select this and say, okay, this needs to be 3000 as well. All right, so there we go. So now the fog is really filling in that valley. Now it kind of terminates here too, right? Because I just had it end at the end of the landscape. But we're starting to get a really, really nice result from this, right? We have localized fog. We can control the amount of noise that's on there. We haven't really done too much tweaking with that. But if I go ahead and close this, right, all of that noise changes are going to be happening on my random field. And so if I go to random field up here, right, I can change the seed number. I can change the scale. I can change the type of noise. Sorry, oops, that's the field. There we go. Here's the noise type, Perlin, right? Turbulence would probably honestly be a better fit for fog. And so, and if I wanted it to be, more like longer in any dimension, I can adjust these values as well, right? And we can continue to tweak things in our material until we're happy with it. Okay. So we've got some fog, we've got some mountains. There's one last thing I want to show you that's kind of cool and creates some really gorgeous lighting, right? We've been really looking at like a daylight scene and using real world lighting. To do that, if I aim down a little bit more, maybe we'll get some nice, right, sun rays here. And note, you can now see through the fog a bit as well. So we still have that detail down there. And right, it takes a while for it to fill in and complete. It's just it's a long process. At this point, right, the way we've done this, we just have really a flat surface. There's no variation there. So we could always come into our volume builder, or actually what might be even more interesting is if we take our cube and instead of having one segment, let's give this 20 segments in each dimension. And then we are going to go ahead and apply a displacer deformer to it. So right, we're going to go to our bend deformer, click, go down to displacer, which is wiggly lines. And we are going to make that a child of the cube. And then with this displacer, if you remember from another tutorial, we're going to go to shading. We're going to go to noise. And it doesn't matter what kind of noise, but if we go to our object and 10 centimeters isn't really going to cut it for us, let's say 500. And it should make some substantial variations in the height, right? So now instead of this being just like a perfectly level thing, there should actually, across this entire object, we should have some chunks, some areas where it does not stand up as high, right? So we're kind of applying two different types of noise to this in order to get a result that's more varied, but still procedural and quick. Okay. So we've got our scene, we've got our mountains. Let's go ahead and turn off our lights, our dome light. We'll leave the environment on, and let's go ahead and turn back on the point light. Okay, so the point light, now you can see, I don't know what, it's basically, right, whatever color I set this to, right, is clearly not going to work for a nighttime scene. I'm going to go ahead and drop this back somewhere in the white, just for now, so we at least have white fog. And then I'm going to go ahead and move my camera so we can actually see that light. Okay, right, so we've got our point source light in our scene. I'm going to go ahead and boost the intensity of that light some. So we've got it here. I'm just going to crank this up a touch more. And I want you to note that we're starting to get like light rays, right? You can kind of see light rays coming through this. And if I blast the exposure, right, we're going to get a lot more light in there. But I'm going to go ahead and drop this down a touch. Okay. So we've got our light set, and I want to show you something that's kind of awesome on lights. You can add textures to any light, right? We added it to the dome light, and we actually got like an image. But what's really cool about adding textures to lights is you can get really interesting color information and light rays. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab a file that I've used for another tutorial. It's just this JPEG of, I believe, Tutankhamun's mask, or maybe Ta, a different ruler. If I go ahead and click open, what it's going to do is it's going to take that image and smear it from a single point and project it on the scene. So I want you to see what's happening. I mean, it's basically like a film projector. So depending on how reflective your objects are, right, you don't necessarily always have them bathed in the image that you're projecting, but you can do some really cool stuff with this, right? If this was just like, you know, a gradient or some other texture that is, you know, or noise or something like that, right? You can create some really dappled lighting effects, some really complex light. You don't necessarily need a, you know, this crazy scene with the projection of these different gods or whatever, or textures on the surface of these mountains. We probably don't need that. If I was to move, sorry, I'm trying to find the best angle here. This is where we were, right? Yeah, okay. So if I pull this down so it's a little bit further out of the mountains, and I rotate my view again so I can still see it, right? At this point, from this perspective, I'm getting those light rays and that kind of crazy lighting, and granted it's a little dark, so I probably need to boost that intensity and maybe pull this up a little bit too. There we go. Right, so I can get all that light, color and stuff without, at least from this angle in this scene, without having the other parts on there. So that's just one last thing you can do. We can always, of course, right, change our whole color profile of all of this. So I could go back to a color. I could make this teal. So there's like a nice teal cast to the entire thing, or I could go with like a more of a blue, right? If I really wanted to go for like a deep, you know, night scene. We could go more purple, right? We could make things make things really weird really quickly. And so these are some of the ways that you can make fog happen in your scene. And again, remember, we can always color that fog using these values. So if we wanted this to be, more fit with the light, we can maybe pull this in and see if we can get some redder tones in here. Well, that's pink. That's really obnoxiously pink. We'll see if maybe if we drop down that. There we go. Right, so there. So right, dropping down the darkening that color really made it fit better with the scene. I think it would be probably better on this side of the color spectrum. And it might still be a little bit too red, so we can just pull that out a little bit more. But there we go, right? So we've got a scene. We've got ways to make really crazy dramatic lighting. We've learned a little bit more about lights as well. And, how to create like fog in any shape that we want it to be in. Okay, thanks for watching.